They say blood is family, but some hearts are colder than a 32-degree winter storm. Think you know the limits of cruelty? Let me tell you about the night my brother abandoned his own son in a freezing mountain blizzard just to frame me for stealing a $5 million trust fund. He thought he built the perfect lie. He had no idea I held the single data file that would completely crush his fake empire. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Ellie Guzman. I am 29 years old, and my life is dictated by the isolating rhythm of the graveyard shift. I work as the night shift coordinator at the Central Operations Hub of Vanguard Alpine Transit. We manage a private railway system that carves its steel veins through the most treacherous, unforgiving mountain ranges in Colorado. Up here, isolation is not just a passing feeling. It is a harsh geographic reality. The dispatch control room is a fortress built of reinforced concrete and thick thermal glass, usually filled only with the quiet hum of data servers and the soft, clinical glow of monitoring screens. But outside those walls, nature is a ruthless, suffocating monster waiting to swallow anyone who makes a single mistake. It was approaching 3 a.m. The telemetry displays on my main console showed that the outside temperature had plummeted to a brutal 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That number alone was dangerous, but accompanied by a blinding, raging blizzard, the wind chill made the air feel like shattered glass against exposed skin. The wind shrieked against the observation windows, a sound so violent and relentless it felt like the building itself was under a physical attack. I was sipping stale, lukewarm coffee, trying to shake off the heavy, stagnant fatigue of the night, when the perimeter motion warning system on our most remote outpost suddenly screamed to life. A blinding red warning light flashed rapidly across my screens, shattering the quiet. My heart slammed heavily against my ribs. I immediately pulled up the infrared security camera feed for that specific mountain sector. Through the heavy, chaotic static of the falling snow, a faint thermal silhouette materialized on the digital display. It was a human figure, barely registering enough body heat to stay visible, slumped lifelessly against the frozen steel barrier of the railway crossing. You do not survive long out there in those conditions. Every passing second in a blizzard like that drains the life and warmth directly from your veins. I abandoned all standard operating protocols. I dropped my heavy two-way radio onto the metal desk, threw on my insulated emergency parka, and sprinted out the heavy steel doors directly into the blinding white fury of the storm. The sheer brute force of the wind hit me like a physical blow, instantly stealing the breath right out of my lungs. The cold was absolute and unforgiving, a suffocating, stinging blanket that froze my eyelashes together within seconds. I fought my way through the knee-deep, shifting snowdrifts, my heavy boots sinking deeply with every agonizing step toward the railway crossing. When the beam of my heavy-duty flashlight finally cut through the dark, swirling snow and landed on the collapsed figure, I stopped breathing entirely. It was not some lost, wandering hiker, it was Leo. He is 21 years old. He is the only son of my biological brother, Julian. Pure panic clawed at my throat as I dropped to my freezing knees beside him. Leo was dying right in front of my eyes. He was already in the advanced, lethal stages of severe hypothermia. His lips were a terrifying, unnatural shade of bruised purple, and his skin felt as rigid and cold as carved marble. His eyes were rolled back, completely unfocused and glassy, staring blankly up into the howling, pitch-black sky. He was completely disoriented, his body rapidly shutting down in a desperate attempt to protect his failing vital organs. But the most horrifying, sickening detail was his clothing. In the middle of a deadly Colorado mountain blizzard, Leo had no winter coat. He was wearing nothing but a thin, utterly useless cotton sweater and light jeans. Thick ice was caked solidly into his dark hair and eyebrows. I screamed his name, but the roaring wind instantly swallowed the sound. Adrenaline flooded my system as I grabbed him tightly under the arms. I hauled his dead weight through the resisting snow, every single muscle in my body burning with exhaustion, until we finally burst back through the heavy doors of the dispatch center. I dragged him directly into the emergency heating room, violently cranking the industrial thermal heaters to their absolute maximum capacity. The sudden, intense rush of hot air was overwhelming. I frantically stripped off his freezing wet sweater, wrapped his fiercely trembling body in 3 heavy thermal foil blankets, and immediately started emergency first aid. I rubbed his freezing hands vigorously, desperately praying for his pulse to steady, watching his chest intently for any sign of deep, regular breathing. Slowly, agonizingly, the extreme heat began to shock his failing system back into a fragile state of consciousness. His jaw trembled violently. His teeth were chattering so fiercely, I genuinely feared they would crack under the immense pressure. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a heartbreaking mixture of pure terror and profound confusion. Through violent, uncontrollable shivers, he managed to whisper his horrifying truth. "Dad told me to get out and check the tires. Then he locked the doors and drove away." The words hung heavily in the suffocating heat of the small room. The absolute cruelty of that sentence paralyzed me. Before the sheer, sickening reality of his words could fully register in my mind, the heavy silence of the adjacent control room was violently shattered. My cell phone, sitting on the metal dispatch desk just outside the heating room, began to vibrate wildly. It buzzed once, twice, 10 times in rapid, aggressive succession. I stepped out and picked it up, my hands still shaking violently from the lingering cold and the rushing adrenaline. It was a relentless barrage of text messages from Julian. The words glaring back at me on the bright screen made my stomach violently churn. He was faking a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. He typed frantic, demanding messages asking exactly where I had hidden his boy. He accused me, in bold, aggressive sentences, of luring Leo away from their family home in the middle of the night. The messages painted a perfectly orchestrated picture of a distraught father desperately searching for his missing son. Then came the final chilling threat. He explicitly stated that if I did not return his son to his doorstep immediately, he was calling the police to have me arrested and charged with kidnapping. Paralyzed, I kept my eyes fixed on the illuminated screen as my nephew struggled for every breath in the room next door. It was a freezing 32 degrees outside, yet that was absolutely nothing next to the monstrous, chilling cruelty of my brother. He had purposefully driven his own son into an icy wasteland to die, and at this very moment, he was engineering the ultimate, inescapable trap to destroy me. By the time the pale morning sun finally broke through the lingering storm clouds, the chaotic adrenaline of the night had dissolved into a sterile, terrifying reality. I was pacing the brightly lit corridors of the county hospital. Behind the closed doors of the intensive care unit, a team of doctors was working frantically to assess the severe tissue damage ravaging Leo's extremities. The frostbite was brutal. Every minute that ticked by felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. While I was hyper-focused on the medical monitors through the glass window, my brother was busy executing a masterclass in public manipulation. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A coworker from the transit hub had sent me an urgent link. I tapped the screen and felt a wave of pure nausea wash over me. Julian and his new wife, Savannah, were broadcasting a live video across multiple social media platforms to an audience of tens of thousands. They had not wasted a single second. They had positioned themselves perfectly on their expensive leather sofa, the soft morning light hitting them at just the right angle to highlight their supposed misery. Savannah was putting on an award-winning performance of a shattered stepmother. She wailed to the camera, clutching a crumpled tissue, wiping away invisible tears from her perfectly contoured face. Beside her, Julian looked directly into the lens with the heavy, devastated eyes of a broken man. He spoke with a carefully rehearsed quiver in his voice, weaving a sickeningly flawless lie. My son is suffering a severe psychological breakdown, Julian told the thousands of strangers watching, and instead of helping him, his aunt took advantage of his fragile state. She lured him out into the freezing night, taking him away from the safety of his family. He did not stop at simply painting me as reckless. He provided the internet with a deeply malicious motive. Julian publicly declared that I was consumed by a bitter, lifelong jealousy. He claimed I had manipulated a vulnerable 21-year-old boy to gain control over his newly activated inheritance. Leo's late mother had left him a massive trust fund, one that legally unlocked the very moment he celebrated his 21st birthday just a few weeks prior. Julian stared into the camera and solemnly accused me of orchestrating a kidnapping plot simply to steal a fortune from a sick kid. Social media is a beast that feeds on outrage, and Julian had just served me up on a silver platter. The digital mob took the bait instantly. The speed at which the venom spread was utterly breathtaking. Within a couple of hours, the video had exploded across the internet. My personal pages were completely overrun. Thousands upon thousands of aggressive, hate-filled comments flooded my notifications. Complete strangers were sending me death threats, calling me a gold-digging monster, demanding I be locked away in a federal prison. The digital witch hunt did not stay contained to the internet. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the angry mob had tracked down my employer. The main switchboard at Vanguard Alpine Transit began to crash under the sheer volume of coordinated calls. Hordes of outraged internet crusaders were actively harassing the board of directors, screaming through the phone lines, and demanding my immediate termination. My career, my reputation, and my freedom were being systematically dismantled by a man who had casually left his own child to freeze to death just hours earlier. The final act of his morning offensive arrived in the form of the local county sheriff. The heavy double doors of the hospital waiting room swung open, and the uniformed officer marched straight toward me. He carried a thick manila folder tucked tightly under his arm, and his expression was completely devoid of sympathy. He stopped right in front of me and flatly stated that Julian had officially filed a criminal complaint against me. The charges were severe: kidnapping and false imprisonment. To support these wild accusations, the sheriff pulled out a stack of brightly printed screenshots. They were fabricated text messages. Julian had created incredibly sophisticated, doctored conversations designed to look exactly as though they had originated from my phone. The fake messages showed me ruthlessly bullying, threatening, and coercing Leo into running away from his supposedly loving father. The sheriff aggressively demanded an explanation. Through the hospital lobby windows, I could already see the first local news vans pulling into the icy parking lot, their large satellite dishes extending toward the sky. A normal person might have cracked right there. A normal person would have screamed, cried, and frantically begged the police officer to listen to the actual truth. They would have rushed to their social networks, desperately typing out long, emotional paragraphs to defend their innocence against the crushing weight of public opinion. I did absolutely none of that. I looked the sheriff squarely in the eyes, my face an unreadable mask of calm. I have absolutely nothing to say without my legal representation present, I stated clearly. I kept my mouth shut. I turned my phone completely off. I embraced the absolute silence. I refused to give them a single word to twist or weaponize against me. Because if my years of dealing with my brother had taught me anything, it was this undeniable truth. If you give a pathological liar enough time, enough rope, and enough of an audience, they will always build their own gallows and pull the lever themselves. While the digital world burned my effigy, I retreated to a quiet, empty stairwell on the 4th floor of the hospital. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared. I did not have the time or the energy to indulge in it. My brother had built his entire offensive on a foundation of theatrical emotion and easily manipulated social media algorithms. He thought he was playing a game of public relations. He forgot that I manage logistics and complex data grids for a living. I counter human lies with cold, unfeeling technology. I pulled out my encrypted work phone. The public had no idea about the level of surveillance Vanguard Alpine Transit maintained over its private routes. I dialed the direct extension of a senior network architect in our IT department, a man who owed me a massive professional favor from a routing crisis 2 winters ago. When he picked up, I did not waste time with pleasantries. I asked him to silently bypass the temporary administrative lock the board had likely placed on my credentials and grant me backdoor access to the fleet's raw video servers. I needed the localized dashcam feed from a very specific heavy machinery unit. We operate a massive fleet of heavy-duty, specialized snowplows that clear the tracks and adjacent access roads before the cargo trains push through. I knew the exact maintenance schedule by heart. Only one machine had been assigned to clear the upper northern ridge during the peak of last night's blizzard. It was designated as Unit V09. My colleague hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before the familiar chime of a secure file transfer pinged in my inbox. I sat on the cold concrete steps, opened the massive video file, and began scrubbing through the dark, snowy footage. The camera mounted on the front of the massive plow captured everything in high-definition infrared. For 20 agonizing minutes, the screen showed nothing but blinding sheets of white powder and towering pine trees. Then, the timestamp in the bottom right corner clicked to exactly 1:15 in the morning. There it was. Through the dense curtain of falling snow, the plow's headlights illuminated the distinctive, bulky shape of a luxury SUV parked aggressively on the shoulder of the isolated access road. I zoomed in on the frame. The license plate was partially obscured by ice, but the make, the model, and the customized roof rack were undeniably Julian's. The plow roared past, but the side-mounted wide-angle lens captured the precise moment the driver's side door slammed shut, leaving a small, vulnerable silhouette standing completely alone in the knee-deep drifts. I had the location, and I had the vehicle. But I needed an ironclad timeline to shatter his fabricated alibi completely. That was when a crucial detail struck me. Leo suffers from severe chronic asthma. Because his father was notoriously negligent with medical appointments, I had registered myself as Leo's primary emergency medical contact years ago. To monitor his respiratory health and potential panic attacks, Leo wore a medical-grade smartwatch that tracked his vitals and location in real time. The data continuously synced to a secure health application on my phone. I switched over to the medical application and pulled up the historical data logs for the previous 12 hours. The digital graphs materialized on my screen, presenting a story that no amount of fake tears or doctored screenshots could ever dispute. I opened the police report file the sheriff had aggressively shoved at me earlier. Julian's forged text messages claimed that Leo was hiding safely inside my apartment, allegedly texting his father at exactly 1:30 in the morning. Julian presented those screenshots as absolute definitive proof of my guilt. I laid my phone down and compared his printed lie to the raw satellite data. At exactly 1:30 in the morning, Leo's smartwatch GPS pinged his actual location. He was not anywhere near the warmth of my living room. He was walking precisely 15 miles away from my address, completely exposed on the treacherous, freezing summit of the northern mountain pass. The biometric data was even more damning. The heart rate monitor recorded a terrifying spike at that exact minute, rocketing up to 170 beats per minute. The internal temperature sensor on the watch documented a catastrophic plunge. It was not a graph of a teenager texting comfortably from a couch. It was the undeniable physiological blueprint of a human body entering a state of severe panic and extreme thermal shock. The data mapped out his desperate, freezing march toward the railway tracks step by agonizing step. Julian had relied on a cheap digital forgery app to frame me. He was arrogant enough to assume that a fabricated text message would be enough to destroy my life. He failed to account for the relentless, unblinking eyes of a corporate transit grid and the microscopic precision of medical telemetry. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt a sharp, crystalline clarity. I downloaded the GPS coordinates, the heart rate graphs, the thermal temperature logs, and the high-definition video files from the snowplow. I organized every single piece of evidence into a single, heavily encrypted digital dossier. I meticulously verified the metadata on every file to ensure the chain of custody was absolutely bulletproof. I was not just preparing to defend myself. I was forging a weapon designed to meticulously dismantle my brother's entire existence, piece by piece. The hospital lobby was a sanctuary of sterile quiet, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors echoing softly down the long, brightly lit hall. That fragile peace shattered violently just past 9 o'clock in the morning. The heavy automated double doors burst open, and Julian marched into the intensive care unit waiting area, like a conquering king returning from a victorious war. He did not come alone. He was flanked by two imposing men in impeccably tailored charcoal gray suits, holding sleek leather briefcases, clearly expensive defense attorneys hired to intimidate the room. Trailing closely behind them was Savannah, clutching a professional-grade smartphone mounted on a mechanical, stabilized gimbal, actively live-streaming their dramatic arrival to her thousands of followers. They immediately turned the somber hospital corridor into their own personal, grotesque reality television set. Savannah let out a theatrical, piercing sob that bounced sharply off the linoleum floors. She narrated her fabricated agony to her digital audience, panning the camera across the exhausted, confused faces of the night shift nurses. "We are finally here to rescue our boy," she announced directly to the lens, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured grief. She completely ignored the flashing red signs prohibiting recording devices and marched aggressively toward the restricted access doors of the intensive care ward. She clearly intended to force her way right into Leo's room and broadcast a tearful, non-consensual reunion to the entire internet. She barely made it 3 steps before the lead attending physician stepped directly into her path. He was a towering man with deep bruised circles under his eyes, wearing a coffee-stained lab coat, and his patience for absolute nonsense was completely depleted. He firmly raised his hand, physically blocking her camera lens. He informed her in a tone of absolute clinical ice that his patient was actively fighting severe tissue necrosis and an unstable core temperature in a sterile environment. He stated plainly that any unauthorized entry would result in her immediate, physical removal by armed hospital security. Savannah dramatically gasped, clutching her chest and pretending to be a helpless victim of a cruel, unfeeling medical establishment. But she quickly backed down when a burly security guard stepped forward and crossed his arms. While his wife created a loud, chaotic distraction, Julian locked his eyes entirely on me. He walked over to the quiet corner where I was standing, projecting a flawless image of a deeply concerned, heartbroken father for the remaining onlookers. But as he stepped uncomfortably close, aggressively violating my personal space, the sorrowful facade instantly dropped. The sickeningly sweet scent of his $500 designer cologne harshly masked the sharp, clean smell of hospital bleach. He leaned his head down, keeping his back angled perfectly away from the observing sheriff, and hissed his true intentions directly into my ear. "You really thought you could outsmart me, Ellie," he whispered, his voice a low, venomous rumble vibrating with absolute arrogance. "Look around you. Look at my lawyers. Look at the massive audience I command right now. You are absolutely nothing but a glorified dispatcher working a miserable graveyard shift. You do not have the money, the influence, or the sheer power to even survive this week. By noon today, you will be sitting in a filthy holding cell, completely broke, publicly humiliated, and permanently unemployable. Do not ever try to fight a war you have already lost." He pulled away smoothly, instantly plastering the mask of the desperate patriarch back onto his face. He turned sharply on his expensive leather heels to face the sheriff, who was standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, silently observing the ridiculous circus. Julian threw his arms wide open in a grand gesture of profound exasperation. "Officer," Julian projected loudly, expertly modulating his voice to ensure every single person in the waiting room could hear his righteous indignation. "I have provided you with absolute, undeniable written evidence. You hold the exact printed text messages proving this woman kidnapped my sick child in the middle of a deadly blizzard. My legal team is standing right here ready to proceed. Why is she not in handcuffs right this exact second? Arrest her now. Do your job and remove this dangerous criminal from my family." The entire waiting room fell completely, breathlessly silent. The nurses stopped typing on their keyboards. Savannah pointed her camera directly at my face, her eyes wide with eager anticipation, waiting for my public breakdown. The sheriff let out a heavy sigh, took a deliberate step toward me, and reached instinctively toward the heavy metal cuffs sitting on his utility belt. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. For the very first time since I hauled Leo's freezing body out of the deadly snowdrifts, I allowed a genuine, razor-sharp smile to curve slowly across my lips. The absolute coldness in my expression was so unnatural that it actually made Julian blink in sudden, unexpected confusion. I slowly, deliberately, reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter jacket and pulled out my encrypted work phone. I tapped the glowing screen 3 times. I opened my secure corporate email client, selected the massive encrypted digital dossier I had spent the last hour meticulously building, and typed in the official department email address the sheriff had printed on the business card he shoved at me earlier that morning. I locked eyes with my brother and pressed send right as Julian opened his mouth to bark another aggressive demand. "Check your tablet, Sheriff," I said, my voice completely steady, ringing out clearly in the suffocating silence of the room. "I just sent you a gift." The sheriff paused, his hand hovering rigidly over his belt. A sharp, loud digital chime echoed from the heavy, ruggedized tablet strapped securely to his tactical vest. He unclipped the device slowly, his eyes darting suspiciously between my calm face and the glowing screen. He tapped the notification and opened the encrypted file. The heavy silence in the room grew completely agonizing. Everyone watched as the sheriff stared intently at the screen. Faintly, through the tablet's small speakers, the harsh, howling sound of the mountain wind from the snowplow video bled into the quiet hospital lobby. It took exactly 45 seconds for the undeniable truth to completely shatter Julian's elaborate mountain of lies. I watched a profound, terrifying physical transformation take over the seasoned police officer. The tense, hardened suspicion he had directed at me all morning completely vanished, washed away and replaced instantly by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He slowly lifted his head, his jaw clamped so tightly the muscles bulged against his skin. The color had completely drained from his face. When his eyes finally locked onto Julian, they were burning with a terrifying, explosive rage. The officer did not look at a grieving father anymore. He was staring directly at a monster. The wheels of the justice system notoriously grind at an agonizingly slow pace. However, when a seasoned police officer is abruptly handed a pristine, mathematically verifiable digital package containing undeniable proof of what amounted to attempted murder, the bureaucratic red tape simply vaporizes. The criminal and civil proceedings were fast-tracked with a ferocity I had never witnessed. Barely 3 months had passed since that horrific winter night, and we were already gathered inside the imposing, heavily polished oak walls of the County Superior Courthouse. Julian walked through the heavy mahogany double doors looking like a man arriving at a luxury country club rather than his own criminal trial. He was dressed in a bespoke dark navy suit that likely cost tens of thousands of dollars. Savannah clung tightly to his arm, wearing a perfectly tailored, modest designer dress, her face carefully painted to reflect the quiet dignity of a wrongly accused matriarch. They paraded down the central aisle, flanked by an entire army of high-priced defense attorneys carrying thick leather binders. They genuinely believed that their wealth and their practiced media smiles could somehow bulldoze over the cold, hard facts. When the proceedings commenced, Julian's lead attorney stepped up to the wooden podium. He delivered an incredibly polished, theatrical opening statement. He boldly doubled down on the exact same vile narrative they had spewed on social media. He looked directly at the jury box and confidently declared that Leo was suffering from a tragic, severe psychotic break. He waved his hands dramatically, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at me, loudly proclaiming that I was a bitter, jealous woman who had manipulated a mentally unstable boy into running away. He insisted that Julian was a desperate hero who had spent the entire night frantically searching the mountain roads for his beloved son. My attorney sat perfectly still beside me at the plaintiff's table. She did not object. She did not show a single ounce of frustration. When the defense finally concluded their grand, deceitful performance and smugly returned to their seats, my lawyer calmly stood up, smoothed her jacket, and addressed the judge. She requested permission to submit our primary piece of digital evidence to the court. The heavy velvet curtains over the courtroom windows were drawn shut, plunging the vast room into a dramatic, heavy darkness. A large, high-definition projector screen slowly descended from the ceiling above the judge's bench. My lawyer did not offer a long, impassioned speech. She simply pressed play. The grainy, high-contrast infrared footage from Vanguard Alpine Transit Snowplow Unit V09 filled the massive screen. The courtroom speakers crackled with the heavy, violent roaring of the mountain blizzard. For a few tense seconds, the jury simply watched the blinding snow. Then, the brake lights of Julian's unmistakable luxury SUV flashed bright red through the digital static. The camera angle provided an unobstructed, agonizingly clear view of the driver's side. The heavy door swung open. The jury watched in absolute, breathless horror as Julian violently dragged his own son out of the warm vehicle. The footage clearly showed Leo stumbling, visibly pleading, completely disoriented by the freezing wind. Then came the moment that shattered Julian's entire fabricated reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. The high-definition camera captured Julian grabbing the thick collar of Leo's heavy winter jacket. With a brutal, deliberate yank, Julian ripped the coat entirely off his son's body. He viciously threw the jacket back onto the plush leather seat of the SUV. He then placed both of his hands squarely on Leo's chest and shoved the fragile 21-year-old backward. Leo collapsed heavily into the deep, frozen snowbank beside the road. Julian slammed the car door shut, the tires spinning aggressively on the ice as he sped away, leaving a sick, freezing boy completely alone in the deadly darkness. The entire courtroom erupted. A collective, visceral gasp echoed off the high ceilings. Several members of the jury physically recoiled in their seats, their hands covering their mouths in sheer disbelief. The judge had to slam his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block repeatedly to restore order over the sudden chaotic murmurs of disgust. I turned my head slightly to look at the defense table. Julian's arrogant posture had completely evaporated. He was physically sinking into his chair, his perfectly tanned face draining to a sickly, absolute white. His expensive defense attorneys were no longer sitting confidently. They were leaning over, furiously whispering to each other, their eyes wide with the terrifying realization that their client had lied to them and their entire legal strategy was utterly destroyed. But the catharsis of exposing his cruelty was only the beginning. My lawyer turned the courtroom lights back on. She was not just there to prove he abandoned his son. She was there to expose exactly why he did it. She signaled to her legal assistant, who wheeled a heavy metal cart piled high with thick, organized banking ledgers and forensic accounting reports, right into the center of the room. She methodically began to present the real, unfiltered truth behind Julian's glamorous public persona. Julian was not a successful, thriving entrepreneur. He was standing on the absolute terrifying edge of total financial annihilation. The documents proved that his businesses were drowning in tens of millions of dollars of toxic debt. His massive mansion had been secretly mortgaged 3 separate times. His luxury vehicles were months behind on payments. He was quite literally days away from a catastrophic public bankruptcy that would leave him completely destitute. Then, My lawyer projected a single, legally binding document onto the screen. It was the financial charter for Leo's trust fund, established by Leo's late mother. It explicitly stated that the massive sum of $5 million would become fully controlled by Leo upon his 21st birthday. That birthday had occurred exactly 3 weeks before the incident on the mountain. The terrifying mathematical logic of Julian's crime was finally laid bare for the entire room to see. If Leo remained healthy and independent, Julian would lose everything. However, if Leo were to be found wandering the frozen mountains in a supposed state of psychosis, Julian could easily petition the state to declare his son legally mentally incapacitated. As the only living parent, Julian would be immediately granted full medical and financial conservatorship. Furthermore, if the brutal cold actually managed to kill Leo that night, Julian was listed as the sole default beneficiary of the entire $5 million estate. It was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was not a disciplinary action gone wrong. It was a cold, calculated, deeply premeditated financial assassination. Julian's lead attorney desperately jumped to his feet, shouting chaotic objections, frantically claiming the financial records were circumstantial and did not prove direct intent to harm. He argued that there was no proof Julian and Savannah had actually planned to steal the money. My lawyer simply smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that mirrored my own. She turned back to the judge and submitted our final piece of evidence. Modern luxury vehicles are essentially massive rolling computers. When Julian's SUV aggressively slammed on its brakes and the door was violently thrown open on that mountain pass, the vehicle's automated emergency diagnostic system briefly activated, assuming a potential collision had occurred. For exactly 60 seconds, the internal cabin microphone recorded everything happening inside the car, transmitting the data to the manufacturer's cloud server. Our legal team had subpoenaed that precise audio file. The courtroom fell completely terrifyingly silent as my lawyer pressed play one last time. The audio was incredibly crisp. The sound of the howling wind from the open door was loud, but it could not mask the chilling, impatient voice of Savannah sitting comfortably in the heated passenger seat. Her words echoed off the courtroom walls, sealing their fate forever. Just let him walk in this cold for a few hours. He will get scared and obediently sign the transfer papers for you. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. There was no objection from the defense table. Julian's lawyers slowly packed their legal pads, refusing to even look at their client. Savannah buried her face in her hands, her carefully constructed composure completely shattered, letting out a genuine, ugly sob of pure terror. The mask was completely gone, and the monsters were finally, undeniably trapped in the bright, unforgiving light of justice. Every single avenue of escape for Julian was permanently, legally sealed. The final, most devastating blow of the entire trial did not come from a hidden camera or a piece of medical technology. It came from flesh and blood. The heavy courtroom doors opened one last time, and the entire room fell completely silent. Leo entered. He was seated in a specialized medical wheelchair, a permanent and painful consequence of the severe frostbite that had ravaged his feet on that terrible night. But as the bailiff wheeled him up to the witness stand, there was no trace of the terrified, freezing boy I had pulled from the snow. His posture was incredibly straight, and his eyes were entirely fearless. He looked directly at the man who had tried to murder him and publicly refused every single desperate plea for a quiet, out-of-court settlement. Leo spoke with a loud, unwavering voice, detailing the years of quiet emotional manipulation and the absolute horror of being locked out of that vehicle to die. The judge did not show a single ounce of leniency. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the block, officially sentencing both Julian and Savannah to lengthy, consecutive terms in a state penitentiary. The final charges were devastating. They were convicted of severe intentional bodily harm, massive financial fraud, and a blatant, documented obstruction of justice. Outside the courtroom, the glittering, fake empire they had built crumbled into dust. Savannah's millions of devoted social media followers completely turned on her overnight. The internet flooded her accounts with the exact same ruthless venom she had tried to direct at me. Every single corporate sponsor, brand deal, and business partner immediately canceled their lucrative contracts. They were left with absolutely nothing but insurmountable mountains of toxic debt and an inescapable public disgrace that would follow them for the rest of their miserable lives. With his abusers safely locked away, Leo was legally granted immediate and total control over his mother's $5 million trust fund. He did not waste a single cent of that money on luxury cars or massive mansions. Instead, his very first act as an independent adult was to sign a massive, life-changing check over to Vanguard Alpine Transit. He fully funded a state-of-the-art upgrade for the emergency heating and survival systems across every single remote mountain station on our grid, ensuring that no one would ever have to face the freezing dark alone again. I did not ask for a single penny of that inheritance. The only reward I ever needed or wanted was the profound, quiet peace of seeing my nephew finally free from that toxic web, ready to build his own beautiful life on his own terms. A few months later, the harsh Colorado winter returned in full force. I was sitting at the small wooden table in my modest apartment. Leo was sitting right across from me, a heavy ceramic mug of dark roasted coffee held safely in his healing hands. He took a slow sip, looked directly into my eyes, and smiled a genuine, bright smile. "We survived the storm, Aunt Ellie," he said softly. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Yes, we did," I replied. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the thick white snow falling heavily against the cold glass windowpane. But the terrifying cold could not touch us anymore. The air inside the room was thick with the quiet, undeniable warmth of a real family, because true family is never defined by bloodline, money, or control. It is defined by the people who will fiercely protect you without question when the absolute darkest night falls. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.